My name's David Seljak, and I'm the director of the Center. Tonight, the St. Jerome Center is pleased to offer the 2003-2004 John J. Wintermeyer Lecture in Christianity and Public Policy. John J. Wintermeyer was a lawyer, politician, businessman, philanthropist, and former student of St. Jerome's High School. John Wintermeyer served his constituents in Waterloo North from 1953 to 66 and led the Ontario Liberal Party from 1957 to 63. But John Wintermeyer was never afraid to roll up his sleeves to pitch in. As a volunteer at St. Vincent de Paul, for example, you could see him going door to door, giving out food hampers. His life work is a testimony to the belief that the hopes and fears and joys of the world are the hopes and fears and joys of the followers of Jesus, and that whatever our vocation or field of endeavor, we are called to remake this world according to the commandment of love. St. Jerome's is grateful for the continuing support of the Wintermeyer family, whose generosity has made the annual Wintermeyer Lecture possible. The topic of this year's Wintermeyer Lecture would have been close to John's heart: the interface between faith and politics. And to help us explore this sometimes controversial topic, we welcome a sometimes controversial politician, Mr. Preston Manning. Mr. Manning served as a member of the Canadian Parliament from 1993 to 2001. And of course, he's always identified with Alberta, and he's a great Albertan, and I knew this, and so I wanted to be gracious over dinner. I said, Mr. Manning, if I was not from Ontario, I would wish to be from Alberta. And he said, well, do you know what, Mr. Seljak? If I was not from Alberta, I would wish to be from Alberta. Mr. Manning has founded two new political parties, the Reform Party of Canada and the Canadian Reform Conservative Alliance, both of which became the official opposition in the Canadian Parliament. Mr. Manning served as leader of the opposition from 1997 to 2000 and was also his party's critic for science and technology. Mr. Manning is also a practicing Christian with a lifelong interest in the relationship between faith and science, faith and business, faith and politics, and faith and conflict resolution. Since retirement from Parliament in 2001, he has become a senior fellow of two major Canadian research bodies, the Fraser Institute and the Canada West Foundation. In 2002, he released a book entitled Think Big, published by McClelland and Stewart, and I might add, available through the good graces of Chuck Arian's Wordsworth book. Every lecture we like to offer listeners a selection of books, and so Chuck has brought that book with us, and Mr. Manning has graciously consented to sign copies of that book later tonight. He is also a distinguished visitor and lecturer at the University of Calgary and the University of Toronto. And in the spring of 2003, he taught a course at Vancouver's Regent College entitled Wise as Serpents and Harmless as Doves, Living at the Intersection of Faith and Politics. So you see, he has some experience of university life, and I was greatly relieved to find this out, because when Mr. Manning arrived here at St. Jerome's campus, his first impression of our students must have been a very strange one. It being Halloween, there was a parade. As he was being interviewed by a reporter from the Record, there was a parade of devils and angels and friars, and he was very impressed with the costumes. And I said, but not as impressed as they were, no doubt. I can imagine them going to a Halloween party and saying, well, you think this costume was good? There was a guy with a wicked Preston Manning costume. Unbelievable, almost lifelike. Mr. Manning questions the conventional wisdom in Canada that faith should be a private, not a public matter, and that the separation of church and state meant that there was no legitimate place for faith in the public square. Mr. Manning argues that in practice it is neither possible nor desirable to keep faith and politics in separate, watertight compartments in a country like Canada, with its deep religious traditions and the continuing contribution that religious communities have made to our public life. So, to help us with this question, I hope you will join me in welcoming Mr. Preston Manning.
Well, thank you very much, David, for the not just for the invitation, but for the opportunity to be with you. And thank you for the privilege of joining in paying tribute to the memory of John Wintermeyer and his interest, not just a theoretical interest, but a practical interest in the connection between faith and public policy and politics. Now, I've noted the names of some of those that have given this lecture in the past, and they include a friend of mine of sorts, former Prime Minister of Canada. So I should probably begin by telling you that I am not Joe Clark. And the reason I have to tell you this is actually I once impersonated Joe. And I feel so guilty about that I have to. Confession is good for the soul, and if I'm going to talk about faith and politics, I should get this off my chest. I ran against Joe Clark in 1988 federal election, the big Yellowhead constituency in northwestern Alberta. It's a big oil field, rancher, mining, riding stretches from Edmonton to the Rocky Mountains. And I was door knocking in the town of Swan Hills, which is an oil field service town. And it was getting late at night. It was kind of hard to see, and I was going to do one more house, and I rushed up the steps of this house to greet a voter at the door, and his puppy ran across the steps just as I got there, and I stepped right on its paw, and it started to squeal like a stuck pig, so much so that people started opening the doors down the block, and this fella grabbed the puppy and glowered at me and disappeared inside to be replaced by his bewildered wife, who came out to see what the fuss was about. And of course the challenge here for a candidate and a door knocker is, how do you recover from crippling a puppy in a town where dogs are more highly esteemed than politicians? So I did the only thing I could say. I said, "Good evening, I'm running for Parliament, and my name is Joe Clark." Joe couldn't go back to that town for about 5 years. Anyway, now tonight we want to talk about the interface between faith and politics, and I might begin by spending a few minutes on what I mean when I use the term faith, particularly in what I say a little later on. We'll probably agree that faith refers to beliefs and values in which we have confidence, and I would add, and on which we are prepared to act. I think professions of faith that are not accompanied by some action are not maybe as genuine as they should be. And of course, it's possible to have and exercise faith in many things. I mean, you can have faith in science, you can have faith in business, you can have faith in the weatherman, you can have faith in the Toronto Raptors. That would actually require quite a bit of faith. But the faith I will be talking about is the belief that there is spiritual realities, that there's a supernatural order beyond our senses that is just as real as the physical realities that we can perceive, and which exists whether we choose to believe it exists or not. This faith includes a belief in the existence of God, and that God and his purposes can be known and entered into by human beings. And as a Christian, the faith I am referring to is not ultimately faith in a set of doctrines, important as doctrine is, or in traditions, as important as Christian traditions are, or faith in structures, as important as structures are. But ultimately, to me, a Christian faith is a faith in a person, in the person of Jesus Christ, his existence, his words, his example, his life, his death, his resurrection, and his victory over evil and death. So finally, the faith I want to talk about, as I say, is something also that cannot be divorced from action. It can't be divorced from what we do. I knew a fellow in Edmonton once that went to a church. I asked him, why do you go to that church? He said, because nothing they do there interferes with with my business, my politics, or my religion. I'm not talking about that kind of faith. I'm talking about a belief that if it is real, and it is a contact with reality, it has an influence on our business and our politics and our faith. Now, to be less abstract, maybe I should take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about my own personal spiritual journey. And as I do this, you might reflect on yours, because each of us are different in this respect, and lo, there's a lot of commonalities. I was raised in a Christian home and a politically active home in Western Canada. And my parents and our home had been very much influenced by the spiritual and political forces that shaped the Canadian prairies, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, particularly in the Depression years. In the 20s and 30s in Western Canada, and this isn't confined to Western Canada, the two great rivers that cut across the prairies of spiritual thought, sort of like the North and South Saskatchewan rivers that cut across the landscape, and I'm more familiar with their Protestant manifestations, but there are Catholic equivalents to both of these. The first was the social gospel tradition. And of course, the social gospel people's perception of the Christian faith, that its primary focus was on social justice, on the relationships between people. And in the old days, when there were social gospel preachers, if you took a social gospel preacher's New Testament and dropped it on the floor, it would automatically open at the 9th chapter of Luke, the story of the Good Samaritan. That we are our neighbor's keeper, that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And then the other big tradition that affected the prairies, particularly during that time, was what today might be called the so-called evangelical tradition, embraced by many conservative Catholics, of course, as well. And the essence of those people's understanding of the Christian faith was that the most primary thing about it was a relationship with God, a personal relationship between the individual and God, a relationship between the community and God. And if you took the evangelical preacher's copy of the Scriptures and dropped it on the floor, it would open up at John 3, the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel, of Jesus talking to a religious man who understood the social dimensions of his faith, but he was talking to him about, unless you're born again, you cannot enter into the kingdom of God. Somebody has said on the prairies that the social gospel people were carrying around the crossbar of the cross, and the evangelicals were carrying around the pole. And if the two of them had ever got together, you might have had a true picture of what the Christian faith was about. Now, my father was raised on a homestead in Saskatchewan. His dad homesteaded near Rosetown, about 90 miles west of Saskatoon. And my dad and his brother ordered a crystal set radio from the old mail order catalogs, and this was in the pioneer days of radio. And Christmas one year, this crystal set arrived, and they erected, you needed an aerial with those things, they erected an aerial on top of their house and listened to the radio for the first time. And one of the first broadcasts that my dad heard on the radio, this was a big innovation in those days, was a Christian layman in Calgary, a high school principal, William Aberhart, preaching the gospel from the evangelical tradition. Aberhart was a pioneer in religious radio broadcasting. And my dad, although he was raised in a good Christian home from a sort of a cultural standpoint, he'd never made any particularly personal commitment to faith. And as a result of listening to Aberhart, he did make a personal commitment of his life to Jesus Christ, to the point where at least he would ask in prayer, what does God want me to do? And ultimately, he came to the conviction as a teenager that he should study for the ministry somewhere. And this Eberhard had a school for ministers in Calgary, so my dad enrolled and became one of the first students at this school. So he went to Alberta to become a minister of the gospel. Now, this was by now in the heart of the Depression, and this Eberhard, he ran a soup kitchen in conjunction with his radio work in the west side of Calgary along 8th Avenue, where the people that were riding the rails in the Depression used to jump off the trains to avoid the CPR police, and they'd end up at his soup kitchen to get soup. And he started to see in those soup kitchen lines young people that he had sent to university to be doctors and to be lawyers and to be teachers. And it just drove him wild. My mother knew him better than my father. She said something snapped in those years for Eberhard. And he ended up getting into politics, at least starting to inquire about what were the economic causes of the Depression. He got onto a theory. In those days, it was sort of a poor man's version of Keynesian economics, that if you gave money to consumers, you might stimulate the economy, called social credit. And he started study groups through his radio broadcast work to study this economic question. And in Alberta, in the 1935 provincial election, these study groups, who first tried to influence the existing political parties to buy their ideas and were rejected, these study groups decided to run candidates in the 1935 election. And Alberta is a funny place this way. It gives long periods of one-party government, and then they get tired of that and they throw everybody out of the legislature and start over again. And that's what happened in 1935. In that election, they threw every last sitting member of the legislature out, the premier, all the cabinet, and all the members of the government, and replaced them. And the primary characteristic for getting elected to that legislature was that you could promise that you had never, ever sat there before. And my father, who had become by that time Eberhard's administrative assistant, ran in that election and ended up in the Alberta legislature. He's 26 years old, I think, and became a cabinet minister in Eberhard's government. When Eberhard died, he became the premier. And typically, say Alberta gives these long periods of one-party government. He was premier for 25 years, sat in the legislature for 33. And so he went to Alberta to be a minister of the gospel, ended up being a minister of the crown. So you can imagine our home was a mixture of all that spiritual tradition, particularly on the evangelical side, and constant involvement in political life. Now, like many young people raised in a Christian home, I went through a period where I had to decide, is this Christian faith just something I've been culturalized into, or is it my own faith? But as a teenager, I made my own personal commitment to Christ. I never had much difficulty. I sympathize with people that do. I've never had much difficulty believing in the existence of God or the deity of Christ or the authenticity of the scriptures or spiritual experience. My struggles have been more with how does this relate to the rest of the world and society? How does that faith relate to science? How does it relate to business? And how particularly does it relate to politics and to government? So much for the past. What about the relation of faith and politics and public policy in the present and the future? And first, why has there been such an upsurge of interest in this subject over the last couple of years? I'm registered with a few speakers bureaus since I got out of Parliament and do some speaking on the university circuit. I get more invitations now to speak on the subject of faith and politics. Well, I used to get none before. In fact, people would invite me to speak and make sure I didn't talk about that. Now you get invitations to speak on, and these are not often from religious groups. These are often from secular groups. There's an upsurge of interest in this subject, which makes it very relevant and germane what you people are doing here. It's always been relevant and germane, but there's a public appetite for discussion, at least, of this interest, if not conclusions. I think that's been driven by a number of factors. The violent clash between the values and objectives of Islamic fundamentalists and secular capitalist Western values, which occurred at September 11th, has shocked a lot of people. There's a connection between faith and politics internationally that can't be denied. And that is going on. The war on terrorism, the recent war in Iraq has got still those dimensions to it. There has been, as a result of that, an upsurge in media interest in the faith roots of leaders, particularly Blair and Bush. The number of articles have been written on their faith commitments, exploring them, discussing them. Where did they come from? What books did they read? What commitments did they make in their younger years? And how does that affect the foreign policies of their governments? World leaders cannot get away today, as we could a few years ago, with saying my faith is personal and has nothing to do with public policy. Even a leader's lack of religious faith has an impact on foreign policy relations with religiously oriented governments. Like if you were introduced to a government leader from an Islamic country and you say, I have no faith, and you profess to be, that goes down into the book, I for infidel, That's as relevant as if you had a faith commitment. So you can't get away with it. There's been this revival of interest in ethics in the business front, prompted by the Enron disaster and the WorldCom disaster, these ethical indiscretions of huge companies that have cost millions of people money and jobs, and there's this upsurge of interest in ethics in business. And it's difficult, particularly in North America, to discuss ethics without getting into the religious roots of ethics. And then just in our own parliament and our own legislatures, as you know from the papers, there's been an increasing number of issues before our parliaments and legislatures with an acknowledged moral and ethical dimension. The debate over the definition of marriage. This bill that just went through the other night on the regulation of assisted human reproduction-related science. It deals with the very genesis of life itself and what's your definitions. It's the first bill where Parliament's had to try to define what it means by genetic material and fetus and embryo and define it in law. And then with the aging baby boom, there's this increasing pressure to alter the criminal code sections dealing with euthanasia. The people today, the polls show, are not so much afraid of death as they are afraid of dying. And laws that affect dying are under discussion. So all of the above involve interactions between faith and public policy and politics. And I suggest to you that they force legislators and public policy makers to think about how are we going to acknowledge and accommodate that faith dimension. They force us as citizens to think through how do we want our governments to relate to these faith political issues. And they force us as believers to think through how are we to live and conduct ourselves at this interface so that we are a credit to our faith rather than a discredit. Now, one thing that's clear to me on this front is that some of the old ways of handling this interface are inadequate under the current pressures. Maybe they were adequate in the past, but I don't think they are today. And I'm referring here particularly to the constitutional doctrine of the separation of church and state, and I'm talking about moral relativism as a way of handling religious differences. On the first point, Canada has tried to handle by the faith-religious interface for quite a while now by extending the U.S. constitutional doctrine of separation of church and state, which incidentally is not embedded in our Constitution. This is an American constitutional principle that many Canadians agree with. But Canada has extended it to mean keeping the entire subject of religion and spirituality out of political discourse altogether. There is an unspoken taboo in the House of Commons, notwithstanding all the protestations about freedom of speech, etc., etc. There is a taboo about speaking about your most deeply held spiritual convictions. We don't talk about that here. And if you start talking about that, the whip in most parties will tell you we don't talk about that here. I once asked, as some of you know, the Reform Party, although it was accused of being intolerant and narrow, in the 1997 election managed to elect the first Hindu MP to Parliament from redneck Calgary, which people ought to think about that. The first Hindu in the House of Commons was elected Calgary. The first Sikh opposition MP was one of our members. There had been a Sikh government member, but the first Sikh opposition MP was one of ours. The first Ismaili MP was one of ours. And I once asked some of I was leader at that time, I asked some of those MPs, I said, why don't you ever speak on some of these moral and ethical issues from the standpoint of your most deeply held religious convictions. You know what they said to me? They said, we watch how you people that are from the Christian tradition, which is supposed to be the kind of majority religious tradition of this country, we notice how you get treated by the media and by your opponents if you ever even get near to that. Can you imagine what they would do to us if we said what we really think on these issues from the perspective of our own faith? That's a great commentary on our, professed tolerance of people. We will tolerate difference as long as it's superficial. But in our parliament, if you get down to people feeling free to express their most deeply held cultural and religious values, there's a taboo. Don't talk about that here. We can't handle the differences that it may generate. Now, what I advocate in this area is by all means keep the institutions of the church and the institutions of religion and the state separately. But I don't think that you can keep the subjects or the spirit of faith and politics separate, because human beings and communities don't. I represented a constituency of Calgary Southwest. If you take polls in that constituency, and you can take your own religious polls in each riding, in fact, it'd be a good thing for people to do and show the results to their MP. The general conclusions from those polls is in many ridings, these are urban ridings, some 70% of the voters profess to have some belief in God, and some specific beliefs in a number of Christian doctrines. Some 50% profess to read religious literature on a more or less regular basis, and some 30% profess to pray. Now, on almost any other issue, if you're a member of Parliament, you find 15 to 20 people coalescing around some position. You cannot afford to ignore that. You can't afford to have a speech in your bag that at least talks about it, just to let them know that you're aware of it. And yet there's these huge groupings around spiritual positions that are utterly unrepresented. And I argue you cannot faithfully represent a community where there's those kind of numbers without some kind of reference or acknowledgement of their spiritual condition. So the object, I think, must be to understand and accommodate the interactions of faith and public policy when they occur, and not to pretend that they don't exist, or that if they do exist, they're irrelevant. Now, the second point under this inadequacy of the old ways is, as you know, moral relativism is the pervading ethic in Ottawa, and I'd suggest many of the provincial capitals over the last 30 years. But it is proving less and less adequate to handle contemporary moral issues. Over the last few decades, many public decision makers have virtually abandoned the search for commitment to any kind of transcendent standard. They say, well, there's just too much variety, and I don't know, there is no transcendent standard. Basically, they're saying there is no truth in this area. There may be truth in science, and there may be absolutes in science, but there's no truth in this area in that sense. I had an interesting encounter. I actually wrote the date because it was kind of unique, on February 5th, 1997, where I had an encounter with the Speaker of the House, the Prime Minister, and his ethics counselor all on the same day in 3 different little meetings. They just happened to fall on that day. And I asked the Prime Minister, this was when there was a bunch of scandals going through the House in the question period. I asked him about the death of Canadians through the tainted blood scandal and the attempt of the government to cover it up, the death of 2 Somali civilians in Somalia at the hand of Canadian peacekeepers, and the attempt by the Defense Department to cover it up, and the broken GST promise. I asked, in those 3 things, did he see any ethical dimension to any of those issues? And I put the same question to the ethics counselor, who was showing up at one of the parliamentary committee meetings that afternoon, asked him if he saw any integrity issue, ethical issue where right and wrong were at stake in any of those 3 incidents. And this was the reply. This was the ethics counselor's reply. He was more eloquent than the Prime Minister, but it's the same thing. And I'm just quoting exactly from Hansard. I think you are speaking about policy questions in which there is a difference of opinion between opposition parties and the government. What these things are not ethical issues. What they are is simply differences of opinion between different groups and individuals. He went on to say, it's the essence of our democratic system. I don't believe I can take your question any further than that. Now, I argue that we have substituted this mantra of moral relativism as the answer to every moral question. And it's basically, and you hear it over and over again, particularly in Ottawa, you believe what you believe, and you believe what you believe, and I believe what I believe, and somehow if we respect each other, it's all going to work its way out. Now, that approach is breaking down in the face of real moral dilemmas and questions. With respect to Enron, that was the ethic that Enron used to use in hiring their accountants. They'd bring in three firms, firm C, B, and A, and they bring in firm C, and they say, 1 and 1, what does that add up to? And of course, the guy would say 2, and they'd show him the door. They brought in accountant B and say, 1 and 1, what does that add up to? He'd say 2, and they'd throw him out. And then they brought in firm A, Arthur Anderson could have been, and they said to him, 1 and 1, what does that add up to? And they said, whatever you want it to add up to. Yeah, moral relativism. And of course, that's unacceptable now. The whole search now is for transcendent standards, at least with respect to business accounting, that are the same for everybody, and that insist on a standard that's much higher and not floating than that. On September 11th, and this, in my 9 years in the Parliament, this was the first time where I saw that faith in moral relativism shaken in the Parliament itself. You could not stand up on that afternoon in that House and say, well, you know, let the terrorists believe this, and let Mr. Bush believe that, and somehow it's going to work out. Like you wouldn't have dared tried to resolve that or even explain that situation with that kind of an explanation. And there is, I think the demand for it's weakened, but there has been since that time a demand for transcendent standards of international behavior that should apply to everybody regardless of what your cultural and individual backgrounds are. And my conclusion here then is that trying to keep faith and politics and public policy in separate compartments and justifying it with the doctrine of the separation of church and state and relying on moral relativism to resolve ethical differences is inadequate, simply inadequate. It's inadequate for the legislator, it's inadequate for the citizen, it's inadequate for the decision maker to handle the challenges that we face. So, the search for better ways, what can we propose? First, a few suggestions for secular decision makers, secular organizations, public sector decision makers. I think such decision makers should be encouraged, and I try to do this, to make a better effort to understand faith perspectives and the spiritual values and the longings that they represent. For politicians, this is not rocket science. It means reading. It means meeting with people that represent these perspectives when they're not hard to find in your constituency, when you got 70% of people profess to have some commitments in this area. And they also mean polling. If you doubt that there's a spiritual root in your constituency, go out and ask your secular pollster to look for it. And he'll come back with some conclusions that you can't deny. The thing that amazes me is I know politicians that will get in a conniption over a 5% shift in the poll in their riding over some obscure issue, but someone comes in with monumental evidence that there's a dimension to life in your riding and among the people of your riding, and you can ignore it year after year. So the first thing, just get a better understanding, and that would include faiths other than our own. In 1998, I went over to India and Pakistan after the nuclear testing episodes there. I just happened to be one of the first Canadian parliamentarians in there. And when I went to Islamabad, I asked, and I had trouble getting a positive response to this from Foreign Affairs and from our own embassy. I said, I want to spend some time with some Islamic scholars. I said, well, why would you want to do that, because we keep faith and politics in separate compartments. Sure, we do, but these guys don't. And so I finally did. It was the Pakistani ambassador in Ottawa that arranged this for me, a session with Dr. Ahmed at the Islamic International University in Islamabad. And we spent 5 hours with him. I said to him at the beginning, I'm here to try to understand. There's 50 countries in the world that profess to be guided in their public policies and their constitutional arrangements by the Quran and by their faith, and you're one of them. And I'm here to try to understand. I don't profess to understand. I think I've read a little bit about it, but I'm here to understand. We went through everything from jihad to the treatment of women. My first question to him was, what difference does it make if the finger on the nuclear trigger is a Hindu nationalist in New Delhi, a Western secularist in Washington, or a conservative Christian in Washington, or a person of the Islamic faith here in Islamabad? And after we went through all of this, at the end I asked him, I said, look, you can have two kinds of discussions with Western-type politicians. You can have discussions with the Western secular politician who actually thinks most of what we've talked about for the last 5 hours is nonsense. He doesn't think there is a spiritual reality. And he'll dismiss this discussion. He'll be polite. He'll say, well, you believe what you believe, and I believe what I believe. It's all going to work out. Or he said, you can have a discussion with me. I'm a committed Christian believer. You and I both believe there's such a thing as spiritual reality, and that they should be applied. But we disagree on some very fundamental things. So which discussion would you rather have? And he said, and I don't think he was just flattering me. He said, no, I'd rather have this kind of discussion. He said, you'd insult me if you came here and said on the scientific front, like, you believe that water freezes at 10 degrees centigrade, and I believe it freezes at 0, but you'd insult my intelligence by saying that. Well, you do the same when you do this in these areas that I consider as real as what Western science considers real. So that's the first. Let's make a better effort. I'm talking more to secular decision makers, at least understand the faith, but you don't have to accept them, but you better understand them. The second thing I'd suggest is that we need to create space for faith-based values and perspectives to be represented. This bill that just went through the Parliament, this Bill C-13 for assisted human reproduction-related science, it sets up an agency that's going to become Canada's senior regulator in this area of genetic science, probably the most important area of science 21st century. If you're a science student, particularly in molecular biology or genetics, you ought to take an interest in that bill because it shapes the legal framework in which your activities are going to be governed, whether you think they are or not. And some of us on the committee, the health committee that reviewed that bill, and I hung around Parliament for an extra year just to be in on this because I felt it was so important. We argued that the bill itself should create standing for certain groups in front of this committee so that when it is making its decisions, these groups were entitled to represent their position. And of course, one of the groups that I argued for was that faith communities should have standing. Now, that doesn't mean that they've got the right to dominate the discussion. It just means that the statute says their perspective has to be taken into account. And of course, lawyers will argue, say, well, anybody with religion's got standing for faith matters on the basis of the Charter. I wasn't just talking about legal standing. I meant real standing. It's possible to let people in the door and say, we don't keep anybody out the door, but to pay absolutely no attention to their perspective at all. By standing, we meant real standing, not de facto standing. I was on a talk show on that bill a while back, and the president of the Canadian Humanist Society called in and disagreed with, he said that religious people shouldn't be given standing or be allowed to get anywhere near that agency. And I asked him why. And he said, because they can't agree on anything. Well, I said, my friend, I sat on that committee and we had a parade of professional ethicists came through, and they didn't agree on a lot of these issues either. But no one in their right mind would have said that we shouldn't have heard expert witnesses from ethicists. In fact, the points on which they conflicted were as instructive as the points on which they agreed. Most of the scientists that came as technical witnesses before that committee, many of them did not agree on these particularly frontier areas. Do you permit therapeutic cloning or not? What can you do and not do with embryos? There's a variety of views. No one in their right mind would have said, well, we won't let the scientists in because they're not in 100% agreement. Yet this fellow felt quite free to say, well, that was reason for excluding religious opinions altogether. So standing, at least trying to create standing for the faith perspective before regulatory tribunals, decision-making bodies, I think is a modest suggestion that we just be wise for secular decision-makers, whether they agree with the faith perspective or not, so that in the end you can make balanced decisions that include these perspectives, balance being one of the prime characteristics of a good public policy. Now then, a few suggestions for people with faith commitments, like you and me. If we're going to live at this interface of faith and politics, it's heating up because of these things that have happened that I've mentioned. I think one of the first things we can do is examine our own faith commitments for genuine spiritual content. As an MP, I met many leaders and supporters of religious groups, denominations, and churches whose commitments and political statements were utterly indistinguishable in essence from those of a dozen other interest groups. They had policy convictions, but they were not distinguishable from others' policy convictions that were not faith-related. They were committed to their organizations, but lots of lobbyists are committed to their organizations. And some, and these were the ones I regretted meeting the most, and a lot of them were from my own religious tradition, were not above threatening and cajoling public decision making. If you don't do what we're saying, we'll organize the church vote in your riding. I think as people of faith, we got to make sure that our faith commitments, particularly as we relate to elected people, have some distinguishing characteristic that sets us apart from materialistic and secular interest groups. I don't think Jesus Christ came into the world to found an interest group. And if our commitment is to Him, there ought to be something uniquely spiritual, whether it's our moral sensitivity or our spirit of reconciliation, or how we conduct ourselves. There ought to be something that distinguishes us as His followers when we lobby politicians for action. Secondly, I believe we need to learn to practice the great guideline that Jesus gave His own first disciples when He sent them out to do public work for the first time. You know, that's recorded in Matthew, the 10th chapter, when He's got His own gang, 12 maybe 70 at most. And He sent them, you know, His first part of His ministry was just with them on a private basis. And He would do the public thing, but they did very little public things. But then there came a day when He sent them out to do public work. And what was one of the pieces of advice that He gave them? Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Harmless as doves. Jesus, as I understand it, invited people to believe in Him and respond to His teaching. But in His dealings with the common people, He never threatened or imposed. Like, you know, in the New Testament, Jesus is accused by His opponents of virtually everything, from being a drunkard to being demon-possessed. But the one accusation you don't find against Him, and the reason they didn't use it is because it wouldn't work. They did not accuse Him of, if you believe this fellow from Galilee, he's going to ram His Sermon on the Mount down your throat. You know, that was one thing they couldn't say about Him, because He didn't come at it that way. He invited people to choose to believe it. And He gave them the freedom to not believe. And He was harmless in that sense. It bothers me that if you ask many secular people, voters in my own riding, why are you afraid of these religious people that get involved in politics? Because I'm afraid they'll use the instruments of the state and the parliament and the legislature to ram their values down my throat. Where did they get that idea? They don't get it from Jesus. They get it from some of His misguided followers. And His own followers. You know, there's that incident. A week before His crucifixion, He's been spending 3 years with these guys trying to convince them of the necessity of conducting themselves this way and self-sacrifice. And a week before His gives them the ultimate expression of self-sacrifice. Remember, they're going through a Samaritan village, and the Samaritans won't receive Him. And so 2 of His most spiritual followers say, why don't we burn the place down? Okay? We'll have a prayer meeting first, but the object is to burn the place down. And He says, you don't know what spirit you're of. My followers, they can be aggressive, they can be vehement in their proclamation of the gospel, but they're not to make people afraid, particularly the common people, harmless as doves. And the second thing He said was wise as serpents. Of course, the serpent in the Scripture is a symbol of evil. And that's a very interesting analogy. He said, you got to be as smart as the devil. You got to be as smart as the forces of evil that you may be working against. And we have examples of that kind of wisdom in the public square. Jesus himself on the taxation issue. At Christmas time, I always used to read into the record for Paul Martin's sake the Christmas story, and it just said to Paul, the part he liked the best was that all the world went to be taxed. But remember, that's a little political comment there. But you remember they tried to hang Jesus up on taxation. This is a public issue, a very sensitive issue. And they brought a coin, and or they asked him, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And of course, you can see that it's a clever question. If he says no, he's guilty of treason. If he says yes, his own people hated the Roman taxation system and he'd lose his own followers. And what did he do? This is an example of wisdom. And this is a sound bite also. It does not very long. He said, give me the coin. Whose picture is that? That's Caesar's picture. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God. That is a shrewd statement. I never had a PR guy that gave me a statement like that. I might be prime minister if I got a guy like that. And the other one, you remember the case, the woman taken in adultery. And they say, now what should be done? Again, they're going to catch him. If he says, they said the law, and they quote the section out of Leviticus, they quote, the law says that she should be stoned. But he's been this ambassador of compassion for sinners. What's he going to do? If he denies the law, he's in trouble with the Sanhedrin. If he authorizes her stoning, he's in trouble with the instincts of those around him. And so what did he say? He who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone. And nobody could say anything after that. I've said to some of my evangelical friends, what if the two people that had been caught in that relationship had been homosexuals? Well, the section in the Jewish law that proscribes that kind of activity is about 2 verses on down from the one that they were quoting to Jesus. His attitude towards that issue was an awful lot different than a lot of his followers. Shrewd, as well as compassionate. I could go on, and this may be in the question period some will ask me, of all the moral crusades that I've studied, because I've studied moral crusades, the one that has the distinguishing characteristics of harmlessness as doves and yet wise as serpents, I think is Wilberforce and Pitt's campaign against the abolition of slavery. You study how that was done. There was a shrewdness to that makes many of our moral crusades today look amateurish in comparison. There are examples, I guess is what I'm saying, of what this is, and I think we've got to learn. One final suggestion, and that is recognizing the importance of being Christian, as distinct from advocating Christian positions. In Christian teaching, as you know, there is the concept of calling, of God calling people, often individuals, to do certain things, or the call to advocate, or the call to action, like the call that came to Moses at the burning bush, or Paul on the road to Damascus. But there is also the concept of the call to be a certain kind of person patterned after Jesus Christ. In Ephesians, the 4th chapter, Paul said it this way, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. He's going to talk about calling, but he doesn't get into a to-do list. He says, be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Be no longer infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, but grow up into him that is Christ. Be very careful how you live, not as unwise, but wise. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love as Christ loved us. I'm convinced that if more of us professing Christians, including particularly Christians in the public square, heeded this call to be, that we would be just as influential for good as those that feel the call to crusade, and influential even at particularly at the interface of faith and politics. Thank you very much for listening to me. I welcome your questions.
I'll take you. Mr. Manning has graciously consented to take some questions, and I will point to people. Do we have a portable microphone? Ivan has it. So if you wish to ask a question, please put up your hand. I'll indicate, and please speak into the microphone. I just wanted to say, I was a little distressed with that opening story about comparing yourself to Joe Clark. I said, maybe we should have called the talk "A Puppy Crippler in a Land of Kitten Eaters." I restrained myself. We have a question here.
Hello, my name is Paul. I'm a landlord with the Post Loans and a member of the Jewish community. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Moni, for your insightful presentation this evening. Traditionally, there's supposedly been a strong support by the Catholic community for the Liberal Party federally. I am a director of the local Canadian Alliance, where the Catholics are a majority on the board. The entire board is united in our strong moral beliefs and religious values, such as opposing same-sex marriage and the ever-expanding cult of the political correctness that marginalizes people of faith and traditions and heritage of our country. Do you see this Catholic support continuing, given that the Preston regime has introduced blatantly anti-Christian legislation banning the name of Christ in military services and references to Christmas in all government offices, be they municipal, provincial, or federal, as well as the absence of prayer or reference to God in national services, such as the 9/11 commemorative ceremony, which is widely condemned by people of all faiths. The question is, how can this discrepancy be addressed and put forward to be appreciated by the Christian electorate or tendency which is allowed to be for even honored?
Okay, that came close to being a speech, is it? Working okay, eh? Well, I'd respond to this by, I'd be careful about tying people's faith commitments to a particular political commitment. I think on the one hand it's advantageous to have people of faith in all these parties, acting as salt and light, because they all need lots of salt and lots of light. At the end of the day, I think believers do want to look, as you've alluded to, at the positions of the various parties, particularly on issues that touch on faith and morality, and make a judgment as to which one that they'd be prepared to support. But I'd be careful about, one of the reasons I actually ended up losing the leadership of my party is I resist appealing to people to vote for particular parties on the basis of their faith. It's a two-edged sword. And in the end, it's more dangerous to the faith side than it is to the political side. So I'd encourage people of faith to get involved with all of the political parties. There will be things that you don't like and you feel are contrary to your faith in each of those parties, and you work to change it. At the end of the day, when it comes to election, yes, evaluate their positions on the things that mean most to you, and vote for the one that you do think best reflects your values. But let's be careful about just trying to harness particular denominational interest, particular parties, one way or the other.
A couple of questions. One
Thank you. I think this picks up quite nicely from the previous question. I was very glad to hear you talking about how important it is to try and understand people's faith, whether it's our own faith or some which is quite different from ours, and the various means that you suggested for doing that. I recently received a pamphlet from Stephen Harper suggesting that as a person of faith, I happen to be a Unitarian pastor in the community, as a person of faith, I interesting to consider perhaps in juxtaposition to that those of us who have been conducting same-sex unions and have been supporting and welcoming loving relationships between people of the same sex have not been permitted to marry people until we luckily had a legal change in Ontario. How would you see the need to uphold the freedoms, particularly of individual faith communities? How would you see that going along with a respect for everybody's rights on the balancing and weighing up of the freedom for the better?
Well, I'll answer that more from the political perspective, but my own view on how this issue should have been handled. First is that it's the Parliament and the legislatures themselves that should have said what's done, not the courts. And if you talk to the justices, of course, they say, we don't want to deal with these things either, but you parliamentarians and legislators, you leave a big hole. You don't say, you don't affirm your own definition of marriage. We get a case, as you got here in Ontario, that forces us to adjudicate, and we're forced to do these things. So the first thing is I think it's the Parliament and legislatures that should come up with a solution to this. The one that I thought is the solution is respectful of both sides, but I think that the right thing is I think Parliament and the legislature should have... is that the thing that's rattling? Okay. That Parliament should have affirmed a definition of marriage that is the union of a man and a woman and is related to the more traditional view of marriage, which is both cultural and religious roots. But secondly, that they should have provided, if other people want legal sanctions of unions of dependence, whether they're same-sex unions or other unions of dependence, that Parliament should have created a legal framework for that, which is respectful of those kind of unions, does not confuse it as being the same as the traditional definition of marriage, which respects the religious tradition of that. Now, I think that's the way that issue should have been handled. And, of course, it hasn't been. It's been left to the courts, and it's very unlikely that this Parliament, at least, is going to legislate on it. And I think that's respectful of the both sides. We could have a big, long debate on this, yeah.
There's a person... Just go ahead. Please speak loudly, sir.
Preston, I appreciate what you...
A little louder, please.
I appreciate very much what you had to say. This new proposed party, the Conservative Party, is going to have to struggle over this progressive dimension that is there. Red Orange and so on is very proud of that dimension, and yet it seems to conflict with policies, attitudes, and so on, the Reformed Alliance, and so on. I'm just wondering what your take is on the progressive element that has to be supposedly taken into consideration before the two parties can come together and have a viable working relationship.
Well, first of all, I think it's in the interest of historical accuracy, it's important, particularly for conservatives, to remember the origins of that word progressive. It was not the phrase, the interpretation that is given to it today. The old progressives were a Western-based political party, almost identical to Reform in their day, that advocated agricultural and transportation reforms. And they got the second largest number of seats in the House of Commons in 1921 and displaced the federal Conservatives. It was felt expedient, more from the Conservative side than the progressive sides, to form a union. And that's where and what progressive referred to was basically the democratic transportation and agricultural reforms of that movement, not the phrase that we use today. But taking into account your question, I believe that the most important skill in the 21st century for politicians that want to get things done, in the federal arena particularly, is this skill of coalition building. I think the days are over when you're going to find some big monolithic group that's got all the support and all the ideas and everything you need to do everything that has to be done. I think it's going to be done more by putting groups together. And this, trying to put the Conservative and the Alliance together, is a good case of that. Now, you can start with the things that they disagree on. So you could start on the social conservative issue. That would not be the place where I'd start. I'd start with find the 5 or 6 things they do agree on, and agree to work together on those. And if there are ones you can't agree on, be honest about them. We can't agree on those. Maybe in the future, after we work together, we can. But if you start with the issues that they're not in agreement, you'll never get the coalition on the things that they agree. So I'd start with the thing, if there's trouble in the social conservative area, then set it aside, and they'll find 1 or 2 things they can agree on, like a commitment to law and order and a strengthening of families, those things they can agree on, and leave the other issues until you can agree. And if you're a red Tory of that variety, or you're someone that can't go along, vote for the other party. Like, I have often thought the red Tories would be more at home, by and large, with the Liberals. And that a lot of the blue Liberals would be more at home in this other thing. And it's not the unpardonable sin to go with this group. And so that's the way I try to resolve that dilemma. I hope they could come to agreement on more than just fiscal issues. But
we have another question here.
Yes, hi. Here's the problem that I have with your view about the separation of church and state. If you and I were to argue about, let's say, the legalization of marijuana, we might be able to argue on the basis of potential harm to people smoking it, and I might point to prohibition or the failure of these kinds of regulations. But if you and I were to argue, let's say, about a more contentious issue, whether it be gay marriage or abortion, and you were to say, I believe what I think because an invisible being tells me something that's in this book that I accept as the truth, and not only that, you're going to go to hell if you don't agree with me. Then suddenly I, as a non-believer, and you as a believer, we no longer have any shared democratic platform by which we can argue and debate the issues. Before it was facts and rationality and reason that we could agree with. Afterwards it's, God said it and you believe it, and I don't share that. So that's the difficulty. Could you comment on that?
yeah, well, the first point I'd make is that I would not talk to you in the language that you talk to me. And I've never gone after any voter, and I've gone after lots of voters, but not on that. I wouldn't do that for the very reason that you say. A, you'll never come to any consensus anyway, so what's the point of doing it? And B, it'll drive you away from even considering my faith. So I'll argue with you on the facts and the contemporary. Now, if you ask me, like, is there deeper values behind your position? Why do you see the facts that way? I would tell you, so I wouldn't hide my faith commitment from you. And that's the way I think you can have civil discourse, be faithful to your own views, but not drive you away, and at some point you may say, well, maybe there's something to what he's saying. I might also just comment, I shouldn't be frivolous on this, but when you go to high schools, I used to always try to go to an educational institution. Every day I was on the road. And when you're leader of the opposition, the time schedule is 50 days a year in your home area. In my case, it was Alberta. 100 days a year in Parliament, and 200 days a year on the road. 200 days a year on the road, year after year. It's because we got a big country and 365 seats. But every day when I was on the road, I'd go to usually a high school or a university. And the first question, because the kids want to be cool, the first question is marijuana. So my handling of marijuana was, first of all, I'd say very seriously, look, the doctors have said that the best way to take marijuana is with a suppository. and then I would elaborate on this. Perhaps there are social ways of taking suppository. And by the time I was through, the kids would be saying, yuck, stop. And then I'd get a little serious with them. I'd say, look, you kids tell me that one of your highest values is environmental purity. You want clean air, you want clean water. You don't want a chemically driven, dependent society. And why would you, suppose we could get the pollution in the air and that down to 1 part per million, and you're going to tell me you're going to suck this chemical into your lungs. What's the point? You can have a kind of but I would discuss it on that level. I wouldn't say God has told me marijuana is bad.
I'm still trying to think of the scriptural passage.
Yes.
There's a question over here.
Yes,
just outside of Freeville in 1904.
Oh, okay.
My Griffin family father's name was well respected and radio show was distinctly regular. But I'm just wondering further about the question. I pursue this from an academic perspective, not a political, but I really think this distinction that you made between what you described as moral relativism as a choice and the other alternative being this transcendental appeal to truth is somewhat of a red herring. I think that can't you, the issue here is what is your justification for advocating a particular public policy or not? And I could turn the tables for you, I suppose, and just ask how does pointing to a transcendental truth resolve the matter? I think we can discuss these matters just as he illustrated by appealing to all sorts of other facts. And more importantly, when you and another faith community, let's say the Islamic community, differ on what exactly the transcendental truths are out there that is to be followed, how do you resolve that, especially in Parliament? Do you bring in religious scholars, or do you actually then go back to the fact that brought us to that disagreement in the first place?
Well, first of all, with respect to Parliament, I think at least you legitimate the kind of discussion that we're having here. Right now, that couldn't even occur. You'd be hissed down and you'd be shut down probably by your own whip. So at least you legitimate the discussion. Secondly, and I might not have made this clear enough in my general remarks, when I talk about the alternatives being just this complete moral relativism or trying to base some standards and policies on transcendent truth, I'm not claiming to have a monopoly or even a knowledge of what that transcendent truth is. But I think the search for it is important. When you discuss moral issues, if you just start right at the beginning and say, well, there is no transcendent truth here. There are no absolutes. So, it's just a competition between our differences. I don't think the discussion gets as far as if you say, look, there has to be some transcendent truth here. I'm not sure that my grasp of it is correct. I see through a glass darkly, as Paul, who could be as dogmatic as the Dickens once said. But let's at least push in that direction. Let's not take the easy route out, which to me is to say, well, you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe, and we don't have to push to even search. And I guess I'm influenced in this too by my own just amateur interest in science. That like I mentioned, the water freezing at 0 or 10 degrees. It's got to be one or the other. I think that moral truth is embedded in the universe the same way as those physical laws are, that we ought to be searching for them. We should admit that we don't have a complete corner on it, but we shouldn't give up the search. And I think the discussion in the search will get you to a better position than not even conceding that there might be a transcendent truth at the end of the road. I don't know if that helps or really answers your question.
One in the far back row. Don't look behind you.
Well, my question was essentially answered. My question was about faith commitment. I was also curious what you thought of the Conservative Party in general, when you were excited about the potential unification and what you thought about that.
Well, I'm in favor of these two parties getting. I think for the sake of democracy, the country needs a viable alternative to the government. Our system doesn't work if there's not an alternative. People get disillusioned with the government. There's a governing alternative to turn to, not just fringe parties or protest parties or half parties. So I'm encouraged by this development. I've been talking about this since about 1998. The one thing that bothers me in this country, I don't mind saying it here, is why does it take so confoundedly long to do what is self-evidently necessary? The balancing of the federal budget. The pollsters will tell you that in 1984 there was enough public support for a government to commit itself to that position. It took this country 14 years. It wasn't balanced until 1988 to achieve a self-evident thing. This bill that went through Parliament the other night on a regulatory framework for the genetic revolution, I mean, everybody knows that that's a huge scientific development and you better have some kind of policy legal framework for handling. It's 10 years since the Royal Commission that recommended that framework. It took us 10 years. The patenting of human life forms. You remember reading about the Harvard mouse case where they tried to patent the Harvard mouse, which was a specially genetically designed mouse with a predisposition to cancer, the onco mouse. The patent was filed in Canada in 1985. The Supreme Court decision was made finally in 2002. 17 years. The mouse would have died. And this particular thing, I'm in favor of it. I agree with it. It's been 5 years since this has been under discussion. The only thing I can say is they cannot go fast enough. Yeah.
Sorry, I responded to the young man behind you. Go ahead.
You're both young men. It's just relevant. It's just here and here. Yeah.
How would you advise a politician then if they had, for example, they were a Christian, they had a strongly held belief in a certain bill that the passing of that bill would conflict greatly with their beliefs if their constituency was in favor of that bill? Would they have to resign, or could they stay and represent the people?
Well, this is a very huge question. It's a very practical question because the believer gets into politics is exactly what do you do when the will of your people, particularly if you can ascertain it, you can't ascertain it on every issue, but some you can, differs from your own personal conscience. Now, all I can do is tell you the way I used to handle it. I'd go to my constituents. First of all, I told my constituents what my convictions were, and I wrote them down in a book. So that I told them what my most deeply held values were in advance. The worst mistake you can make is keep them quiet. Then when this occasion comes where now your convictions are telling you, say, oh, by the way, I didn't tell you, but I have these convictions, it's too late. Do it at first. Now, the way I did it with my writing, I told them, on these types of issues, if it's clear that you have a consensus and a view on it, I will vote for it, even if I profoundly disagree with it. Because that's the only way your views are going to get registered in the Parliament. Because your constituents have their beliefs and consciences too. How are they going to get represented in the Parliament if you won't do it? But I also said to my constituents, I will come to you and I will argue for a different position. And I will try to persuade 51% of you that we should go this way instead of that way. Now, one of the practical things I found is if people actually believed you defer to their judgment, 9 times out of 10, they would defer to yours. What they just wanted to know was that if push came to shove, you would represent their view. So that was the position I took. There's other members of Parliament that said right up front, look, on this issue, this is my position. I can't compromise. I feel that it compromises my own integrity, and I'm going to do this. So if you don't want me to do that, don't vote for me. The other thing I said to my constituents was if this happened too often, we come to a parting of the ways. I would not feel comfortable representing your view. I can't advocate. I won't argue for it in the House. I'll just vote for it. And you would not be happy with me because you know I don't believe what you believe. So those are the two ways of handling it. At the fear of going on too much, the issue where I really got into this, but if I hadn't been a leader, I'd have done this every year. But on the euthanasia issue, remember the Sue Rodriguez case? When Sue Rodriguez was afflicted with Lou Gehrig's disease, she wanted the right to die, and a physician-assisted suicide. She went to the courts to see if she could get permission. The court denied it. She ended up with a physician-assisted suicide. At the time that issue came up, there was a strong move in the Parliament to strike the section of the criminal code making physician-assisted suicide a criminal offense. And so I had a dialogue on a moral issue with my constituents. The one time I really spent time and energy on it. I circulated a questionnaire to every house in the riding, given the pros and the cons. I had the pros and the cons written by interest groups on both sides, not by myself, and had a write-in survey. We had an electronic town hall meeting. I used to like electronic democracy. We had electronic town hall meetings we'd get on the cable TV that served my riding. We had a panel discuss the question. We'd had the questions on the screen. You pushed a touch-tone phone and you could vote one way or the other. We had town hall meetings, several of them, where you get, they're not representative, but you get the activists, the people that can motivate lots of votes. We had a debate at that. We took straw votes at that. Then I had a public opinion survey, a scientific survey done after all this discussion of attitudes in my riding. And I used to use the opinion survey to calibrate the other inputs. How representative are these other forms to that? And in my writing on that issue, I argued against striking the criminal code provision. I argued that the governments ought to be on the side of trying to conserve life. If you ever give them a slip for taking it, I don't know where it's going to go. But when the results came back, from 60 to 80% of my constituents said they would like to do away with that section of the criminal code. And this is why democratic discourse is never so simple. They also said, but there should be safeguards that it's not abused. And the safeguard, they suggest about 15 different safeguards from all of this input. When I took them to a lawyer and said, how would you put this in a statute? He said it would take about a 30-page statute to establish the regulations that they want to replace this one section of the criminal code. So I ended up having this discussion. And we ended up not at the position I was at the beginning or where they were at the end. So, there is such a thing as a possible democratic, intelligent, moral discussion. At the end of the day, you have to make those decisions, but there may be things come up in the course that neither you nor your constituent thought about when you started out.
Well, perhaps this may to follow through along with that. It sounds like you're really aligned with Daniels, but the concept is where a politician who does possess certain values goes into Parliament, where is his road to Damascus? Where does he sort of fall off the rails? Why can't he follow through with his own precepts? What forces him to toe the party line?
Well, you put your finger. The question here is, why is it that people get into Parliament and end up towing the party line? And the basic reason is, our Parliament is not democratic. When the Soviet Union was falling apart, and Mr. Kretchen got up in the House one day and said, look, there's going to be people coming over from Eastern Europe to see how we run democracy. I got up and said, excuse me, where do we take them in Ottawa to show, do we take them to the question period? That would inspire them. Do we take them to the Senate? Do we take them to committees and see the rubber stamp? And the biggest single thing that has to change in our Parliament, with respect to the point that you raised, is we still cling to what's called the confidence convention. That if a government motion, including a government motion to adjourn the House at 5 o'clock, if it is defeated, according to the government, they are obliged to resign. Or if an opposition measure is carried that is contrary to the government's position, they feel obliged to resign. And that's the club they use over you as an individual member. You may not like this bill, but if you vote against it, you could bring down the whole government. Now, the answer to that, the British have done this a long time ago, is to not make every measure a measure of confidence. If a government measure is defeated, let that be defeated. Then have a motion saying to the House, did you just mean to defeat that section of that bill, or did you mean to pull down the government? And of course the government members would go back and support the government on the confidence motion, although they'd vote against it on the bill. And the single thing that would change it in the House of Commons, it takes a 20-second statement by the Prime Minister. This confidence convention is nowhere in the Constitution. It is not in the Parliament of Canada Act. It is not in the rules of the House. It's a pure convention. And if the Prime Minister just got up, and if Martin would do this, I would dare him to do it, get up and say this government will not regard the defeat of a government motion or the passage of an opposition motion as a defeat of the government. If that happens, we'll have a confidence motion. That one change would free up members of Parliament to more faithfully represent their constituents and more faithfully to represent their own conscience. It's such a pathetically simple thing, and I just wish it could be done.
We'll make this the last question.
Just like to reflect your comment on this. You were saying that in Parliament today, it's kind of to be representative of your faith is to be blacklisted, essentially. And I guess I would argue that maybe it's representative of a more secular faith in the economy and the faith that the growth of the economy having a solution for everything. I wanted to comment on that as a term from more traditional, like actual faith.
Well, I think there's two questions in your one question. I think the actual reason for the taboo in the Parliament does not have much to do with economic values or things of that kind. I think it's because political people do not know how to handle this faith-political interface and how to represent it or to argue it or discuss it. So the simplest way to handle it is just to keep it out. I really think that's the motivation. But on the other thrust of your question, I think it's true that the preoccupation of society wholly with the materialistic side of life and the economic side of life is a detriment to spirituality generally, not just in the Parliament, but in the marketplace, in the university, and every place else. And in the church, that's right. And so I think that's another area when Christians are being salt and light in the economy. And this is an area where I talk to my conservative friends. Conservatives are strong on the economy, but, you know, man does not live by bread alone, which is why some of these so-called social conservative issues shouldn't be shoveled out the back door. Or as in Alberta we say, man does not live by oil alone. But it's pretty hard to convince some people of that. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. I want to make just one or two housekeeping announcements before we close. And one is that the next lecture of the St. Jerome series is called Understanding Terrorists and Martyrs, Personal Encounters with Religious Militants. And it's the 2003-2004 Teresa Deese lecture, and it will be given by Cynthia Mahmoud of Notre Dame University on Friday, November 14th, so 2 weeks from today, 7:30 in this room. And I think Mr. Manning's comments opened the door for me to make that announcement. As well, the very next day, the Deese lecture is tied into an event called Challenge for Change. Challenge for Change is a one-day ecumenical forum, and this year it is featuring Mary Jo Leddy, and that will be Saturday, November 15th from 8:30 to 4 p.m. at St. Peter's Lutheran Church, and this in Kitchener. And this is an event that is sponsored by the Eastern Synod of the Lutheran Church in Canada, as well as the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience, the Social Affairs Committee of the Diocese of Hamilton, as well as our ecumenical partners. There are registrations, forms, and information about that Challenge for Change event at the back table with Carol Person. As well, Chuck Arian, he's here with, I mentioned before, of Woodsworth Books. He has some books related to our earlier speakers. John Allen's, for the first talk at the St. Jerome Center, John Allen's book Conclave, I noticed on the desk, as well as Mr. Manning's own book, Think Big, is there. And finally, in the back I should also mention, there's a sign-up sheet. Tonight's lecture was taped. All of our lectures are taped. If you wish a tape of tonight's lecture, it is available to you at cost, which is $10, our cost of producing it, and you can see Carol Person about that. There's a sign-up sheet if you wish to receive our brochure at the beginning of the year for the year's series of lecture. There's an email sign-up if you want announcements about the lectures one at a time. As well, the Social Justice Committee of the St. Jerome's Catholic Community has a desk where they are selling organic, fair trade coffee. I always say free trade, and people say, no, that's the opposite of fair trade. Fair trade, organic coffee, chocolate, and tea. But it is, while I can thank Mr. Manning informally, to do this more formally, our President, Michael Higgins, will come up. It is thanks really to Michael and to our Chancellor, Richard Gwynn, that Mr. Manning is with us tonight. They have a group that meets in Toronto and looks at religious literature together, and they discuss it. And I said, and Mr. Manning's there, and Michael Higgins said yes. And I said, boy, I mean, it must be nerve-wracking to meet a man of such political power and historical importance. And Michael responded that it probably was, but that Mr. Manning didn't show any signs of stress. So, while I still have my job, I think I'll ask Dr. Higgins up to the podium.